Hey, NIO fam, happy Thursday to you. It is about 10 minutes until 1 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, October 2nd, 2025. There's your date and timestamp. And I'm going to do this video in two parts. It's going to be a longer video. I'll create timestamps or chapters in the description so you can move around and look at different topics or, choose as you may not want to watch all the way through to the end. But the first part, I want to do more shorter term focus. And then the second part will be big picture, longer term. So first off, we've got the NIO stock price right now at about 778, 779. And we already have more on the trade volume side of things with almost 56 million shares traded than we had all of yesterday during the day. So I take the fact that NIO is moving up and continuing to sort of slowly consolidate at higher levels to be bullish in the short term. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We'll come back to this data as well. But I also want to talk about what's going on in China because there's a holiday this week. And with that, you've got a new record on the battery swaps. And in fact, I'm going to share a lot of different accounts and some posts that they've put out there. So I'll highlight all of that again in the description. You'll be able to look it up and follow them if you'd like on your own. But this we'll come back to as well because it's the battery swap, and battery as a service in particular that differentiates NIO as sort of a leader and very innovative and disruptive. And we'll talk more about why I think that translates to a bigger stock price moving forward into the future for NIO. Also, this is going on. I mentioned it in my most recent video that although it is a holiday, folks are still taking delivery and NIO is still getting deliveries done. Now, I do want to offer this because I have shared it before, but my understanding is that there are 3 work days after taking delivery when insurance registrations must be filed. So if government offices are closed next week or this week, we may not get any data or very little for the insurance registration side of things. So just a heads up on that. And we'll see whatever data comes in. We'll talk about it if it does come in next week, early in the week, usually Tuesdays when we get those. Also, NIO with the ET9 Horizon, the specialty edition, the price point on this is pretty high, and that's only going to help NIO with margins. Of course, they have their own chips in here, and we're still going to have to wait. I think the ET9 is going to be ultimately where NIO showcases when it's ready, just how advanced it is with its autonomous driving. But I don't think they're ready to show that yet, so I think we've got to wait, and I don't know what the time frame on that is. I want to do a little transition now from the short to big picture long term. And this is important to note is that even in China, where NIO is dominant with so many swap stations, it's still not widely known across the country. This is also consistent with what William Lee had told us before. And that is that even the NIO brand and their sales, at least within the last year, is when he shared this in an earnings call, we're still doing about half of their sales in just one geographic region in China. And that ties into market awareness, which is my first, major growth phase for the company. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. These are a couple of tweets I put out pre-market. I saw what was going on and I referenced the video that I put out, and I said, hey, hopefully, I didn't say, hey, but I wrote, hopefully the dark pool prints on October 1st that I highlighted in my video were buying. And if so, we may see it reflected in NIO stock to the upside, in other words. And so this was a timestamp that I wanted to offer at that time that I posted, $7.81 pre-market. It was, I think, about 5 a.m. Central Time, my time, when I posted that. And now let's continue the transition. This is the video from yesterday. And I just wanted to offer sort of both sides of things. For example, down here, we had NIO coming in with the new delivery record in September, 34,749. And then I followed that up here with NIO as a company looks beautifully positioned to finish 2025 strong while setting the tone for a strong 2026. And here's kind of the word of caution. Although we have seen a nice reversal of NIO stock in the short term, there are a few things, including some that I highlighted in today's video. This is, again, the video from October 1st, that made me cautious and uninterested in only hyping the NIO stock price to the upside. And then I also linked both, I did a bear and a bull case video. And basically with each of those, I gave a time frame sort of into the end of the year and even a little bit beyond for either side. Because, again, I don't want to just be so myopically focused on only one thing happening and not recognizing that other things can happen. And I went to this one too soon. We're going to come back to this because I do want to highlight that. But let's go back to what we saw last Friday, especially with Friday coming tomorrow and options expiring. And last Friday, it seemed like what we saw was a sell-off that maybe was directly related to the Max Payne NIO stock options expiry at $7. And it's $7 again this Friday. But I am encouraged by what we've seen with the stock price action. And even yesterday, although I may have sounded bearish, I was really being more cautionary and just kind of saying, hey, we don't know what's going on with these dark pool prints. But on a lower volume day, the reality is, NIO stock is holding up well. And I'm talking about both yesterday and today, although the volume is a little bigger today. And you can see this is going back a year. We're essentially now trying to consolidate. NIO's trying to consolidate around or above the high from the last year. And so now let's zoom in and look at more of the short term. So I can highlight a couple of things. And again, the volume, the trade volume is the easiest indicator. 100 million plus share trade volume days are when we usually see the bigger moves by NIO. Like in here, we saw, on 4 of those days, back to back to back to back, we saw a nice move up. What had been an area range price point that we hadn't seen in a while that I was watching. And then once again here, this was the dilution time frame right in here. But then, so that volume was very big and the stock price came down, but it really shot then once we had a couple more days of 100 million shares. So maybe we're going to see again, and that's sort of why I referenced in the video and talked about the next, price targets to the upside, $8, then $10, 15, or 14 to 16. And by the way, here's your pre-market. What I noticed, this was a 4 a.m. Eastern time window, that 5-minute incremental window, and the high was 784, the low was 778. Over here, you had this really long wick to the downside at 8 a.m. Eastern time, but even that low was 763. So again, it just continues to move up and move up nicely. I believe this was the high, the wick off of this one was $8.02, and that was right at the open within the first 5 minutes. So it looks positive. I'm still more bullish than anything else at this point in the super short term for the stock price, but I have been and remain long-term with my view. And now let's talk about that, because the IDE, NIO as an IDE, an innovative driven enterprise, is so critical. It's so important. And the reason that I chose this company as my favorite long-term stock. And the idea was that I think it can go way beyond what others are expecting it can go with the stock price. And I'm going to show you some really compelling data here with several other IDE companies as to why not only have there been a few patterns and sort of concept overview consistencies, it's going to be amazing when you see it on the chart when I pull it up. So, my 3 first major growth phases for NIO are market awareness, profitability, battery as a service. And the market awareness, one of the things that I showed earlier in one of the posts was folks, this one, it was this one. These folks used to have a Tesla. Now they have Onvo L90 and they love it. And here's the thing, and this ties into the big picture, the long term, and that is, market awareness. The brand still has to be known. Back to the reference from William Lee about how a lot of their sales, about half their sales have been coming from just one geographic area in China. And PowerSwap, is still being learned about even within China. This is still an early stage for the company. So, I don't want to forget that or get too caught up in only the short-term stuff. And by the way, let me do this. I'm going to switch this guy out, because now we're talking big picture long-term. And the IDE is so important, but there are a couple of things that are really critical with this. And this comes from some folks over at MIT. I'll link, again, everything in the description. But IDEs typically do heavy investment and they focus on global markets. So they're looking at spending a lot of money. And a lot of folks used to call it cash burn. Maybe some of them still do, referencing NIO as wasting money or suggesting they're wasting money. But I've always seen it as investment. And the growth trajectory for these IDE companies, because of the heavy investment, they go negative before they have explosive growth and positive profitability, essentially. Now, here's where it gets really fun, because I'm going to offer a few examples. And this is where the FTD stuff, big picture, I think becomes really, really interesting and kind of fun to track. This is the whole history of NIO stock. Now, You see this roughly 3 to 4 year downtrend that NIO stock has been in. The yellow is showing the stock price, but if you'll also notice how much of the FTD data came in, and this is only the US market. Of course, NIO is traded also in 2 other global markets. So just within the US market, we're seeing all of this. It could be manipulative of the stock price. But even if it's not manipulative, let's just go with, okay, it's just heavy shorting. And the idea is the short thesis is still in play because the company is not yet profitable. That's why profitability is the second major growth phase for me, is that's an important point. But here's where it gets really fun. I'm going to show 3 different companies, and I'm going to show with their history of FTD data back to a certain point. And what you'll see on the chart very clearly demonstrated is this. First off, let's take Netflix. This is our stock price that has gone meteoric since back in this time frame where you had such heavy FTD data. Now, back in this time frame, I suppose the argument would have been that streaming is never going to be a viable service. It's never going to take over. It's not going to take off. And so what you have is this innovative, disruptive idea at an early stage. And then once profitability and a lot of profits are proven out over the course of time, well, then you see not only the FTD data drop off, but you see the stock price absolutely take off to the upside. All right. So that's your innovative driven enterprise, Netflix, along with the history of the FTDs. Now let's talk about Tesla. Tesla took a long time and a deluge of shorting before they got to profitability. Now they did have the bonus of being included in the S&P 500 around that same time. And I do think that also helped contribute a lot of buying pressure. But once again, what you see is this heavy FTD data earlier on when the short thesis was still in play. Once profitability came in, the short thesis became less and less viable, and the stock price absolutely tore or took off to the upside. How about one more? And there are more of these. I just wanted to do these 3 because the concept idea of, basically you've got 3 different concepts. One is the transition into streaming for Netflix. One is the transition into smart cars or smart EVs, which Tesla was a pioneer of, and now NIO is taking it to another level. And now we've got Apple. So with Apple, if you think back to, for those who are old enough, and if you're not old enough, then you probably don't know what life would be like without a screen on your phone. But there was a point in time where that was not a thing. And so again, you have an innovative, disruptive, a major shift that has to take place. But earlier on, there would have been this short thesis in play. And again, we see this heavy FTD data coming in. And so I believe, and I would argue, that these innovative, disruptive companies at an earlier stage are much easier for predators who want to short and make a lot of money off in that shorter term window or time frame. The thing is, at some point, once they show profitability and or massive profitability, the short thesis not only gets crushed, but the stock price just rips to the upside. So I wanted to show all that. And now I want to come back to NIO, because the battery as a service, the power swap stations, and the fact that China's never had a globally dominant premium brand, all those things sort of tie into why I originally picked this company and this stock. And I understand, and I don't necessarily disagree with anyone who wants to say, well, it'll never get to, let's say, a $500 stock price. However, I'm not going to rule that out. In fact, that was kind of my thinking early on, is the reality that so many people have a hard time seeing it. I would argue that back in those early days for each of those other companies, people would have had a hard time seeing them do what they have done, especially with respect to the stock prices. So here's where things maybe get even more compelling, is if you focus on this little time frame, which, if we think back to the charts and those 3 other companies, that they never had a move like this before they had massive profits or profitability, right? So how much more compelling does this become, as NIO should only become better known on the global stage? And as I have it on the bottom of the screen with my long-term view, you've got the market awareness. Even within China, the brands are still becoming known. And the Envo L90 and now the refresh of the NIO ES8 are really going to help pave the way for NIO. However, it is still so early that in that high-end price point, that range. And I didn't queue up the data, but Mercedes, Audi, and BMW have sold, I believe, easily 1 million gas vehicles just in this year to date in China. And in the future, those sales are going somewhere else. They're not going to be gas sales in the future. So NIO still has a significant opportunity with a lot of market share ahead that it can take. And it is still just becoming known, even within its home market of China. At the same time, they have kind of reworked the way they're doing their global expansion in a very intelligent way. I like what they're doing now. They're partnering with local distributors. They're also giving folks the opportunity, investors globally, to put in power swap stations and essentially leverage that. So I do think that once we see profits, it's going to be fun to track how profitable they can be and how, the global growth and expansion helps that, because I do think they have an advantage over some of the, better known, like your Tesla and your BYD, that are maybe having to take on, more costs because of different reasons within their business model. But anyway, that's market awareness. And then of course that kind of rolls into profitability. So profitability, I think we've got a shot at seeing it in this fourth quarter. William Lee has certainly been focused on it. And provided they're able to get these numbers out that they're talking about, and that it looks like they're doing, they certainly have a great shot. And then with the carryover into what typically would be a harder, that first quarter timeframe in China with sales, and Chinese New Year it falls in February this year. So if NIO can have a great push in January, especially with deliveries, they may really surprise with their numbers, and that may really help pave the way for profitability for the full year in 2026. And then battery as a service, that's for me personally. I want to wait until we have 1 million NIO sales, and that's just the NIO brand. And then I'll kind of do a reset and look at everything, stock price, the company, what's going on, and see what my thoughts are. So I know a lot of folks are out there putting the NIO 100 and talking about that. I personally, from early on, my thinking was I wanted to accumulate 2,000 shares with the idea that at $500 per share, that would be $1 million of NIO. That's me. That's my big picture, long-term take. So let me get this thing up and out before the end of the day. Actually, no, hold on. Let's come back and do a brief take on right now. Just over 58 million shares traded. The price is $7.84, and it is about 5 minutes after 1 on Thursday. It's Central Time is when I'm recording this. So I'll get this thing up and out before the end of the trade day. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I'll see y'all again very soon.